영어 동화 세상 리틀팍스.
Grandpa's World History. Chapter 1. A Civilization is Born. Grandpa! Laurie called, knocking on the study door. It's dinner time! She opened the door and found Grandpa bent over his desk as usual. He was an archaeologist and worked very hard. When he wasn't out traveling and researching, he was home in his study. What are you doing, Grandpa?
I'm tracing an ancient map of Mesopotamia.
He said. What? Laurie peeked over his shoulder and saw a piece of tracing paper covered in wavy lines. 2 lines were drawn in blue and made a sort of V. What are those 2 squiggly lines?
Mesopotamia was the name of a region in the Middle East, where human civilization arose thousands of years ago. These 2 lines are the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Thanks to them, humans in that area had water for farming, fish to eat, and mud and reeds to build houses. You may have heard of the Sumerians. They were the most powerful people there in what became known as the Cradle of Civilization. The Sumerians may have lived in mud houses, but they were very sophisticated, and we owe a lot to their inventions. For example, they developed the first writing system. They began writing with pictures. So to indicate a star, they would draw a picture of a star. And water would be written by drawing wavy lines, like the waves in the Tigris and Euphrates. Later, they developed those pictures into symbols that represented ideas or objects. Eventually, they created signs to represent the sounds of their language. Their writing looks choppy because it was pressed into clay tablets using thin tools made from reeds. After that, they baked the tablets in the sun. In addition to being masters of language, the Sumerians were clever mathematicians who tried to use numbers to organize the world around them. They were especially keen on dividing time. Our calendar with a 30-day month, a 7-day week, 24-hour day, 60-minute hour, and 60-second minute is based on their math. Can you believe we owe so much to people who lived over 5,000 years ago?
No, but I can believe Mom will be mad at us if we don't go downstairs and eat dinner, Laurie said.
Your mother is like the great King Hammurabi of ancient Babylonia, which was an area of Mesopotamia,
Grandpa said.
She lays down the laws around here.
I've heard of him. Wasn't he the scary king who asked for an eye and a tooth for a tooth? Laurie shuddered.
Yes, I guess we might say he sounds scary now, but Hammurabi's laws kept society in order at a time when there was lots of fighting between tribes. I think his laws are interesting because they teach us about what was considered important in ancient Mesopotamia. For example, we know that people were expected to take responsibility for their work and actions. If a house collapsed and killed the people inside, the builder was put to death. But unfortunately, punishment wasn't always as clear-cut as it sounds. You were often able to escape a harsh sentence by paying a large fine. In ancient Babylonia, it helped to be wealthy. Would you like to see pictures of Babylonia's capital? It was called Babylon and was one of the most impressive cities in Mesopotamia. Those huge structures are called ziggurats. They were built entirely out of mud bricks. They were probably very difficult to build. People took great care in building them, however, because they were made for worshiping gods. The steep sides were stepped and covered with beautiful gardens. At the top was a shrine. The most famous ziggurat is the temple to the god Marduk in the city of Ur. You recall the Tower of Babel from the Bible, don't you? In that story, people tried to build a tower that would reach the heavens, but they failed in the end. Some believe the ziggurat in Ur is the basis of the biblical legend. The city of Ur, which is in present-day Iraq, is thought to connect to other stories from the Bible as well. It was the home of Abraham, and when archaeologists first discovered the ruins of Ur in the 1800s, they found evidence of a great flood that had likely wiped out most of the city. They believe this may have been the basis of the great flood story in the Bible as well. You know, the one that led to Noah building his ark. Wait a minute. I have something to show you from the excavation at Ur. A British archaeologist uncovered some of the grandest treasures of the ancient world when he found the temples and cemetery there in the 1920s and 30s. The tomb of Lady Puabi, for example, was full of beautiful things. This royal woman was buried with all her riches and was covered from head to foot in jewels and gold. Lady Puabi's real headdress is in a museum, but I have a replica. A replica is something that's made to look exactly like the real thing. Try this on for size, Lady Laurie.
Grandpa leaned over and placed a delicate headdress decorated with dangling golden leaves, rings, and flowers on Laurie's head. Laurie, didn't I send you to call Grandpa for dinner 10 minutes ago? Laurie's mom shouted. What are you two doing up there? Dinner is getting cold. That's Lady Laurie to you, Mom, Laurie said. She turned on her heel and strode out the door, her headdress jingling. Grandpa's World History, Chapter 2, The Gift of the Nile. Laurie had just come home from school when she heard a light hammering sound coming from Grandpa's study. Curious, she tapped on the door. Grandpa, can I come in?
Just a second.
Grandpa answered. Laurie heard lots of shuffling.
Enter.
Grandpa was sitting empty-handed at his desk, but there were wood shavings everywhere.
Aren't you supposed to be at school?
He asked. It's over at 3. What were you doing in here? Laurie said suspiciously. She saw something wooden poking out from underneath a book. Aha! She cried, pulling the object out. What's this?
Well, Miss Nosy, that's your birthday present. But now it won't be a surprise,
Grandpa said. It was a wooden crocodile with a string attached to the top of its head, so the mouth could be opened and shut. Laurie pulled the string and snapped the crocodile's jaws.
It's an ancient Egyptian toy,
Grandpa said.
I made this, but if you were a child in ancient Egypt, you might have something similar. Crocodiles were a significant part of Egyptian life because the civilization was built along the Nile River, and many crocodiles lived there. The Egyptian civilization has been called the gift of the Nile because the Egyptians depended on the river for many things, including irrigation and fertilizer. It flooded every year, supplying much-needed water and nutrients to the surrounding land. This made farming easy for the Egyptians. The soft, wet land also made good mud for building mud brick houses. And the river unified the people of the area by providing a convenient highway for transportation and communication. Ancient Egypt was an agricultural society. You know what that means? It means life depended heavily on farming. If you were a little Egyptian girl living about 4,000 years ago, your father would probably be a grain farmer. Grains were the most common crop, especially wheat and barley, which were used to make bread and beer, the most typical food and drink. Unfortunately, children didn't get to go to school like you do now. You'd probably spend most days helping your parents. During harvest season, maybe you would bundle wheat on the farm. Or perhaps you'd be at home helping to cook or take care of the vegetable garden near your house. But Egypt wasn't all farms. If you were a well-to-do Egyptian family, you might live near a city.
Grandpa said, looking around his desk. He handed Laurie a drawing of an ancient Egyptian city. What's this big thing? Laurie asked, pointing to a large structure rising above palm trees.
And what's that funny picture of a bird with a beach ball?
Oh, that's the temple to the sun god Ra. He was the most important god, as the Egyptians thought he was responsible for the rising sun, which brought light and nourishment to their land. Many temples were built in worship to him, and that's not a bird with a beach ball. That's Ra in hieroglyphics, an ancient form of writing. Just as the sun looks different throughout the day, Ra appeared in many different forms. But most often, he was shown as a falcon carrying the great big sun over his head. Every morning, he rose from underground and traveled across the sky in a boat. And every evening, he went back beneath the ground. He had the most important job of all, creator of the universe. The next most important job was that of the pharaoh, the Egyptian king. Pharaohs were considered part god. They were in charge of politics, the military, and the welfare of their citizens. They were also the link between the gods and humans. Without the pharaoh, Egyptians thought, the world would end up in chaos. But the pharaohs lived a life of luxury compared to common farmers. They owned most of the land, lived in huge palaces with many servants, and could get whatever they wanted. Both their responsibilities and wealth continued after death, too. When a pharaoh died, Egyptians believed he became the king of the dead and buried him in an elaborate tomb. In order for him to be able to perform his duties properly, he had to be buried with everything he would need. This included his body, which was preserved, and his most valuable possessions. Inside the tomb, the walls were also covered with paintings of slaves, food, and animals. You've seen pictures of the pyramids of Giza, right?
Uh-huh.
Those magnificent structures were tombs for pharaohs. The tomb paintings have taught us a lot about the Egyptians. For example, one of their favorite sports was hunting. Egyptians are thought to be the first people to hunt purely for pleasure. The area around the Nile was full of wildlife. They hunted birds, gazelles, lions, and hippopotamuses. Hippo hunts seem to have been particularly popular. Hippos, live mostly in the water. Egyptians hunted them with long spears from boats. Hippo ahead!
Grandpa cried, jumping up and pretending to spot something in the distance.
Attack!
He yelled as he hurled an imaginary spear into the air.
Grandpa, did they hunt crocodiles?
Laurie asked worriedly, holding the toy on her palm. Grandpa returned from his fantasy hippo hunt and looked at Laurie.
Well, I haven't seen any pictures of it, but hunting dangerous animals was a way to earn respect, and crocodiles are pretty dangerous. But crocodiles were associated with the water god, whom Egyptians both feared and honored. So perhaps your little crocodile would have been spared.
Grandpa smiled and tapped the crocodile on its head. Laurie smiled too. Laurie, I'm home, Mom called from downstairs.
Hi, Mom. I'll be right down.
Laurie hollered back.
Thanks, Grandpa. I'll pretend I never saw this,
she said, putting the crocodile back on the desk.
Until next time.
Until next time. Bye, Laurie.
Grandpa's World History, Chapter 3, Traders of the Sea.
Grandpa, we're home!
Laurie shouted as she ran up the stairs. She had just come back from the beach with her dad and was carrying a jar full of seashells.
Choose any one you like, but only one,
she said, standing at the study door.
Thank you,
Grandpa said, examining the shells closely. He took a small peach-colored shell from the jar.
I'll add this to my collection.
You have a shell collection too?
Laurie asked.
Well, I have just 2 shells. but they are very special ones from Lebanon.
Grandpa reached high on a shelf and took down a bowl with 2 spiny seashells in it.
These are sea snail shells from the Mediterranean coastline. I found them when I visited Lebanon last year to research the ancient Phoenicians. They were seafaring merchants who lived there from around 2000 BC to 500 BC, when they were taken over by the Persian Empire.
What are seafaring merchants?
Said Laurie.
People who spend a lot of time sailing at sea and make their living by trading things.
Grandpa explained.
The coasts of Lebanon are surrounded by high, rugged mountains, which protected Phoenicia, but it also made it difficult to travel by land. So, out of necessity, the Phoenicians became great shipbuilders and seafarers. From their coastal cities, they sailed to other Middle Eastern cities and to Africa and Europe. There, they traded their goods for things they couldn't find in their homeland. They are considered the first organized traders and merchants of the world. Even though we call them Phoenicians and the area they lived in Phoenicia, they weren't really united into a country or empire. Phoenicia was more like individual cities that developed close to one another. But when the Phoenicians traveled around selling their goods, they became known as one people, the Phoenicians.
Did they simply sell these seashells by the seashore?
Laurie asked, giggling.
Oh, no, silly. But the sea snails that came from these seashells, were the source of the Phoenicians' most valuable item, purple dye. Purple dye hadn't yet been discovered anywhere else, and when the Phoenicians began to make cloth dyed this wonderful purple, people loved it. But hundreds of snails were needed to dye even a small piece of fabric. So the dye-making process was very time-consuming, and therefore the dye was worth a lot of money. It was so expensive that only royalty or the very wealthy could afford anything purple. That's how purple became known as the royal color. Glass and cedar wood were also popular Phoenician items. Cedar, which grew in the mountains of Lebanon, was rare in neighboring lands. That made it highly desirable. It was also perfect for building and produced great smelling oils. The Egyptians in particular bought lots of cedar, which they used to build temples, palaces, and coffins. The Phoenicians' seaside location helped them with something else, glass making, because glass is made with sand. People think Egyptians had been making glass for a while, but the Phoenicians developed it into an art. They made colored beads, clear vases, and other beautiful glasswork. We owe a lot to the Phoenicians for their creations, but they are most famous for one thing. You know, as merchants, it was important for them to keep records of all their sales. What do you think they invented to help them do this?
Grandpa paused.
Receipts?
Laurie guessed.
Well, yes, but how would they write receipts if they didn't have an alphabet? The Phoenicians invented the first 22-letter alphabet. Of course, written language had gradually been developing since the time of picture symbols like hieroglyphics, but the Phoenicians created the first letters representing sound alone. We can even trace our alphabet back to theirs. Here, what do you think this says?
Grandpa wrote 3 Phoenician letters on a piece of paper.
Triangle, circle, cross, D-O-T. Dot!
Laurie cried excitedly.
Amazing! You can read Phoenician!
Grandpa laughed. He handed her an open book from his desk. The page showed a chart of the Phoenician alphabet.
Wow! Letters have come a long way in 3,000 years. I wonder what they'll look like 3,000 years from now,
Laurie said. She flipped to another page in the book.
Ooh, who is this? She's beautiful,
she whispered.
That's Jezebel, Princess of Tyre. Tyre was a city on Phoenicia's coast. It was one of the richest, most powerful Phoenician cities. The king of Tyre married his beautiful daughter to the king of Israel's son, Ahab. He thought this would keep good relations between the two neighboring peoples, but he was wrong. In Israel, the Jewish people worshipped one god, while Phoenicians worshipped a number of gods and goddesses who they believed controlled weather, harvests, the sea, the moon, and so on. In other words, the natural world. Now, Jezebel was a passionate woman who loved her husband, but loved her native religion more. She asked Ahab to build temples to her gods and goddesses in his land, and she encouraged the people of Israel to join her in worship. The Jewish leaders got upset. They destroyed the Phoenician temples and killed the Phoenician priests. In all the political turmoil, Ahab and Jezebel were also killed. Oh,
Grandpa sighed.
wow. What a story for a beautiful Saturday afternoon.
Oh, why do strong women in history always die tragically?
Laurie cried.
One day soon I'll have a story for you about a strong woman who lives to see a happy end,
Said Grandpa.
Well, I'm going to put this stuff in my room now. But I'll always think of crushed sea snails when I wear my purple tank top and of that ancient, funny-looking alphabet when I'm writing. And you can have another seashell. Catch!
Laurie said. She tossed another shell from her jar to Grandpa and walked out the door.